Hi, class. It's Dr. Lindner. Let's take a look at muscle metabolism. So, how do muscles derive their energy? How do they derive their energy? So, in order to derive their energy or to derive their ATP, the body can get energy from different sources. First, we have creatinine or creatine phosphate, which is CP, creatine phosphate. Another is anaerobic glycolysis. Anaerobic means we don't need oxygen available or present for that. And then cellular respiration, which is aerobic respiration, does require oxygen. So the body doesn't like to have lots of ATP hanging around in excess. So the body's going to store the additional phosphate someplace else. So what we're going to have, we have too much ATP. So ATP can be reduced to ADP. We can lose a phosphate, right? Here you have three phosphates. Adenosine diphosphate is two. So where did this phosphate go? This phosphate joined with creatine. You have creatine here. Creatine bumps into ATP. It's going to take that phosphate with it to create CP or creatine phosphate. And then what you're left with is ATP with one less P, which is ADP, adenosine diphosphate. So we have this CP, the creatine phosphate. Now that can be used. That could be used for muscle contraction. And when the body needs energy or ATP, once again, we have ADP that can bump into the creatine phosphate. This phosphate can go and attach to the adenosine diphosphate. If you add another phosphate to this, you end up with adenosine triphosphate. So the phosphate goes here, and then what you're left with is just the C, so you end up with creatine. All right, so the enzyme that is used for both adding and removing this, it's called creatine kinase. Sometimes it's referred to as creatine phosphokinase or CPK. And these are found in muscle cells. CPK is an enzyme that's found in muscle cells. So if this is a muscle cell and we have CPK in it, creatinine phosphokinase, and this muscle cell becomes damaged, the membrane becomes damaged, some of this CPK can leak out. When it leaks out, it can go into the bloodstream. It can go into the blood vessels, and the amount of CPK that's in the blood goes up. Whenever we take blood and we look at CPK or CK levels and they're high, it tells us that there's probably muscle damage. And commonly it's seen with people that have heart muscle damage, like in heart attacks. Okay. So this type of energy that we have in creatine phosphate, your body goes through this pretty quickly. This is not the type of energy form that can last for hours. This is a very short period of time. This is like someone doing a deadlift, or a power lift. All right. This is like your power lifters that need energy for a very short period of time. Now, if you need energy after 15 seconds, creatine phosphate is not your guy. You have to go through a different level. So what we were saying before regarding ATP and creatine, so at rest, the muscle produces more ATP than it needs. So it's going to transfer the ATP, transfers the energy or a phosphate to creatine. So you have ATP plus creatine is going to yield ADP plus creatine phosphate. During each contraction, the myosin head breaks down the ATP, producing ADP and phosphate. The energy stored in CP is used to recharge ADP back to ATP. It's a reversible reaction. So you can go this way or you can go this way. ADP plus creatine phosphate is going to create ATP and creatine. And again, you need that enzyme CPK to make that work. If the CPK crosses the cell membrane because it's damaged and it enters the bloodstream, it's usually indicative of some sort of muscle damage. So that's a little bit about CP. But when the creatine phosphate stores are depleted, you got no more, then we have to get energy from someplace else. We can get it from anaerobic glycolysis. Remember what glycolysis is you're taking a 6-carbon sugar. You're taking a 6-carbon sugar and we're going to break it down into 2 3-carbon sugars, right? What they did is they breaking this bond here, and we're going to break this bond here. That's what glycolysis is. It's breaking down glucose. When you break down glucose into this, you get 2 pyruvic acids. Okay, this is pyruvic acid. This is what happens if this is the cell, and this is a nucleus, and this is the mitochondria. Glycolysis takes place here in the cytoplasm. Doesn't take place in the mitochondria, but it does take place in the cell in the cytoplasm. Okay, so where do we get this glucose from? Well, where is glucose stored? Glucose is stored in muscle. And the storage form of glucose in muscle, remember, anything that ends in -ogen is the storage form. It means it's inactive. So glycogen can be converted into glucose. Glucose, which is this 6-carbon sugar, is broken down into pyruvic acid, which is this. Okay. Now, if and only if oxygen is present, pyruvic acid, the pyruvic acid can enter the mitochondria for the Krebs cycle to take place. If oxygen is not present, then you can't make ATP yet. You have to have oxygen available for cellular respiration, which is the Krebs cycle, to take place. If oxygen is not present, then pyruvic acid is converted into lactic acid. Okay, now lactic acid is another type of sugar, but this is what happens if oxygen is not present. So if you're exercising and you're training at the gym, and all of a sudden you're really going a little bit too far and you're huffing and you're puffing and you're out of breath and there's no more ATP left, your body is going to get the clue. It's going to get the message that there's no more oxygen and there's no more ATP. Your body produces a little lactic acid and you're going to get a little burning sensation in your muscles. All right. So when you get these metabolites that build up, that's when you quit. That's when you're like, I'm done. I need a break. I have to pause. Let me catch my breath. Let me catch my breath so I can go from an oxygen depletion and go back to oxygen. Okay. Now, aerobic glycolysis, the glucose that's circulating, whatever glucose is in your system, that can last a little bit longer than creatine phosphate. Creatine phosphate was only, what, 10, 15 seconds, short duration, a quick burst of activity. But glycolysis can provide you with a few minutes of energy. Now, after a few minutes, let me show you this. This is the anaerobic, same pathway that I showed you. Glucose gets broken down. That process is called glycolysis, and it takes place in the cytosol or the cytoplasm. So if that's the cell, that's the nucleus, that's the mitochondria. The cytosol is the same thing, right? That's the stuff here. That's the cytosol. Glycolysis takes place here. The glucose is broken down into pyruvic acid. You get a little bit of energy, not much. You get some ATP from it, but not too much. Remember, there's no oxygen available. This is anaerobic respiration. So the pyruvic acid is not going to enter the mitochondria. It's going to be converted into lactic acid. Now, lactic acid is going to give you the pause, right? It's going to allow you to pause. The lactic acid is going to find a way into the liver to be converted back into glucose for this cycle to happen. So this ends up being like a two-way street. Pyruvic acid can go to lactic acid, but lactic acid back to pyruvate. I'll show you how that works in just a second. That pathway is called the way of removing lactic acid and to help it recycle, and it's called the Cori cycle. It's the removal and the recycling of lactic acid by the liver. The liver converts lactic acid to pyruvate. Okay. Glucose can then be released to recharge muscle glycogen, which is the storage form of glucose. So lactate can be converted to pyruvate, pyruvate back to glucose, but first it becomes glycogen. So if we have muscle and we have glucose in muscle, glucose can be broken down into pyruvate. That's called glycolysis. If oxygen isn't available, if we don't have oxygen available, pyruvate becomes lactic acid. Now, we can't produce lots of ATP from that. So what the muscle does, it says, hey, lactic acid, let's see what you can do. Go into the blood, find a way into the liver. Now that the lactic acid is in the liver, it can be converted back to pyruvate with lactate dehydrogenase. To go from pyruvate to lactate, it also used lactate dehydrogenase. So it's the exact same enzyme, whether you're going from pyruvate to lactate or from lactate back to pyruvate. And from pyruvate, pyruvate can go back to glucose. And then glucose enters the blood, find its way to its muscle, and then glucose can be broken down to pyruvate. If oxygen is available, then this pyruvate is going to go into the cell, into the mitochondria. It's pyruvate is hanging out here in the cytoplasm because that's where glycolysis takes place, in the cytoplasm. With oxygen, pyruvate can enter into the mitochondria to produce energy. If oxygen is not available because you're huffing and puffing, you have no energy, it goes to lactate. Lactate, right? This is where the pause, This is where the rest comes from with your exercise. The lactate finds its way to the liver to be converted back to pyruvate and glucose. This is called the Cori cycle. This is what they thought, if you go back many years ago, they always thought that Lance Armstrong was winning all these Tour de France competitions because they said he had an unbelievable Cori cycle. This guy could cycle for days and not get tired. They were saying that his turnaround to produce energy was unlike any other human being, right? But what they found out was that he was doping and he was injecting himself with EPO, which is erythropoietin, which means his body was pushing out more red blood cells. If you have more red blood cells, you have more oxygen. If you have more oxygen, you have more ability to make ATP. But he was cheating. He denied it for years and years and years, and eventually he got caught. Now, in terms of cellular respiration, this requires oxygen. So under aerobic conditions, the pyruvic acid can enter the mitochondria, and it goes through a series of oxygen requiring reactions for the sole purpose of making ATP. So the oxygen from the hemoglobin in the blood, that's going to enter. We need oxygen to make ATP. We need glucose. We need the sugar. So from glucose, you get pyruvic acid from glycolysis, and pyruvic acid can enter the mitochondria for the Krebs cycle to take place and the electron transport chain. Your body can use fats and lipids, right? Your body can use triglycerides to enter the mitochondria to make energy. And last but not least, your body can use protein that it breaks down into amino acids. It doesn't want to do that, but if there was no glucose and there was no fat, then you have no choice but to use your own protein. So this is what happens when people are chronically ill. If they're sick and they're not eating, and they go through glucose pretty quick, then they burn through their body fat, right? These are chronically ill people that are in hospital settings, and all of a sudden they're not eating, they have no appetite, they're so skinny, right? Now they have no more fat on them. What's left? The body starts to break down its own proteins, which means its organs, its own organs. It's going to start to break down the liver, the kidneys, the spleen, muscle mass. Anywhere that there's protein, it's going to self-digest. And this is what happens when people are chronically ill and they start to predict they're not eating for 3 days, 4 days. They probably have enough fat on them to last them a week or two, or there's no more fat. They're relying purely on their own body tissues and they self-digest themselves for the sole purpose of providing a little bit more energy for the heart to beat, for the brain to work. So whether it's the glucose, the fat, or the protein, the body's going to make ATP. And the byproduct of making that energy is that although oxygen is coming in, CO2 is leaving, as well as water. So here's cellular respiration, also known as the Krebs cycle, also known as the citric acid cycle. So you have glucose. This is the cytosol, right? Out here is the cytosol. This here in the middle, this is a mitochondria. So we have glucose that's going to be broken down into pyruvic acid in the cytosol. That's called glycolysis. That alone, yes, you're going to make a little bit of ATP. Not much, just a little bit. But what we get from this pyruvic acid, the pyruvic acid can enter into the mitochondria for the Krebs cycle. And the Krebs cycle it can make some energy. The Krebs cycle needs B1, B2, B3. It needs your B vitamins for this to work. So the Krebs cycle makes some ATP, but its main job is that it's going to make coenzymes. And the coenzymes that are produced in the Krebs cycle goes into the electron transport chain. I abbreviate ETC, stands for electron transport chain. The coenzymes that the electron transport chain uses is NAD and FAD. N is from like niacin and F is from riboflavin, flavonoid. So you need the B vitamins for this to work to create coenzymes for the electron transport chain to work. And the electron transport chain is what's making the majority of the ATP is needed by the electron transport chain. And the electron transport chain is very dependent on iron. And it's really dependent on CoQ10 to function. Fe is iron. So the electron transport chain needs iron to make ATP. Well, that kind of makes sense because what happens if someone has iron deficiency anemia? What's the main symptom of someone who's anemic due to too little iron is they have fatigue. They have too little energy. Well, they have too little energy because iron is needed to make ATP. If you don't have iron, you can't make enough ATP and you've got fatigue and you're tired. Women during the monthly bill, during the menstrual cycle, when a woman is menstruating and she's losing blood, which has hemoglobin, and hemoglobin has iron. So women may not have the most energy during that time of month as well. Now, CoQ10 is needed. Coenzyme Q10 is also needed for the electron transport chain. And CoQ10 has gotten a lot of attention. It's gotten a lot of attention because if we look at how the body makes cholesterol, we go from acetyl-CoA to hemoglobin, HMG-CoA. HMG-CoA gets converted to mevalonate. You don't have to memorize this. I just want you to see something. Goes to mevalonate, to pherenzyl pyrophosphate, to squalene, and then all the way down here at the bottom, your body makes cholesterol. Okay? And cholesterol is needed. Why is cholesterol needed? Well, cholesterol is needed to make a lot of hormones. Testosterone, progesterone, estrogen, vitamin D, your cell membranes, antioxidants. So you need cholesterol for that. But in the same pathway that the body makes cholesterol, the body also makes CoQ10. Why do I bring this up? I bring this up because many people take statins, which are anti-lipidemic drugs. They're trying to lower your cholesterol. When you take a statin like Lipitor, Crestor, Simvastatin, Arvostatin, anything that has a statin in it, the statin blocks this enzyme. It's called HMG-CoA reductase, right? You have acetyl-CoA to HMG-CoA. HMG-CoA has to be converted to mevalonate before it gets to cholesterol. But if you take a statin, you block the necessary enzyme that converts this into this. So if you block this, it means you can't produce cholesterol. But if you can't produce cholesterol, what else can't you produce? You can't make coenzyme Q10. And if you don't have CoQ10, what can't your body do efficiently? If you don't have CoQ10, then the electron transport chain doesn't work and you can't make lots of ATP. So the recommendation is that for those that are taking cholesterol medication, and these are typically taken in the evening at PM, they're taken in the evening. Why? Because your liver makes cholesterol at night. If you take these statins in the morning, you're still going to have high cholesterol. You have to take it in the evening so that the drug its half-life works. It blocks the enzyme long enough so that you don't make cholesterol. Okay, but at the same point in time, you don't make CoQ10. So you take, if someone really is in a crisis situation that needs a statin, then okay, they're blocking their body's ability to make cholesterol. They're also blocking CoQ10. That's why people supplement with CoQ10, or they would take, it's also known as ubiquinol. Ubiquinol is CoQ10. Okay. It comes in two forms, ubiquinol and ubiquinone. This one's cheaper. This one's more expensive. Okay. What ends up happening is, I remember years ago, I had a patient that came in and I saw her and I said, okay, Pat, I'll see you in a month or two. She comes back in like 2 weeks and she came in with a cane. And she said her hip was killing her. All the muscles around her hip were hurting her. So when she came in and I analyzed her hip and I examined her, there was nothing structurally wrong with her hip. Muscles were good. They hurt, but there was nothing wrong with it. The joint looks good. Her range of motion was good, but yet she was having so much hip pain. So I said, this is not biomechanical. This has to be biochemical. Are you taking any different supplements, any nutraceuticals? The answer was no, 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 no. I said, any new medication since I've seen you last month? She said, yes. I said, what are you taking? She goes, I started taking a cholesterol medication. I said, do you know what it's called? She goes, I don't. I just know it's for my cholesterol. I said, does it end in the word statin, like simvastatin, arvastatin? She goes, yes, 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 it does. So I said, okay, you're taking a statin. That means you don't have CoQ10, enough of it, which means if you don't have enough CoQ10, you can't make energy. What body parts require the most energy? Wherever you have the most mitochondria. Where do we have the most mitochondria? Two places, muscle and your neurology. So muscles and nerves. When the muscles don't have enough fuel, they don't have enough ATP, they cry in pain. They cry in pain. Anytime you hear the word algia, it means pain. If you have myalgia, that means muscle pain. If you have neuralgia, that's nerve pain. If you have arthralgia, that's joint pain. So she was having myalgia and arthralgia, muscle and joint pain. So I said, what I'd like for you to do is I'd like you to take some CoQ10. I want you to take it for 2-3 days and we'll check in on you. She messaged me 2 days later and she said she felt brand new. So I said, need you to go to your medical physician. You need to let them know that you're having an adverse reaction to the statin. And that's exactly what it was. She was having an not an adverse reaction, because statins do that, right? We hope that it does this and lower your cholesterol more than it does this, lower your CoQ10. But I was researching in a pharmaceutical journal. It says that CoQ10 is depleted by 40% in just 2 months' time. Right? So you need, CoQ10 is an antioxidant and it's needed for energy. So it's very, very important. So I tell my patients, if you're taking a statin and your physician wants you to take it, then take it responsibly. Take your statin at night, but take the CoQ10 in the morning, because this provides energy. You don't want to take this at night. You don't want to be up when you want to be sleeping. Okay. And muscle fatigue, if we look at the concept of muscle fatigue, it's the inability to maintain force of contraction for a long period of time. So what creates fatigue? Maybe there's the inadequate release of calcium from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. That's a possibility, sure. Maybe there's a depletion of creatine phosphate. That could do it too. Maybe there's a depletion of oxygen. Maybe there's a depletion of glucose or nutrients or B1 or B2 or B3. Maybe there's the buildup of lactic acid. Maybe there's not enough release of the neurotransmitter acetylcholine at the neuromuscular junction. These are all things that can cause muscle fatigue. So what does why does the body, if you're kind of breathing heavy, right? Why are you doing that? When you're exercising, why is your body breathing so heavy? It's trying to take in enough oxygen to pay back the oxygen debt. And as you breathe in the oxygen, enough oxygen, it allows you to replenish the creatine phosphate. It helps convert lactate back to pyruvate, and it helps to bring oxygen back into the muscle. Okay, good place for me to take a break.